Chapter 10 is a huge chapter. There's a lot going on in here. The cardiovascular system alone would have been sufficient for its own individual chapter. Personally, I wish that they would have left it as such, just so that it would be a little bit more manageable from the student perspective. But since they did put it into grouping it with the immune system and the lymphatic system, as well as the blood in itself, which could be considered part of the cardiovascular system, but really should be or could be its own individual section. That means we've got a whole lot of words to cover in just that small amount of time. That being the case, we're just kind of jump into this, understanding that I'm not going to be able to cover a whole lot of the terms in detail. I will try to hit some of it, like the main concepts and the overview of the systems, as opposed to just hitting on every single term. But do try to look at the information that's in the text, which will be helpful to you. And I want to point out at the very end of the chapter on page 448 and 449, there is a table of all of the words that are from word parts and then all of the words not from word parts. And it separates it down into the different systems that we're going to be talking about. Use that as a reference. This is something that's at the end of every chapter. However, it's not as useful. Nice that it lists everything, but everything's part of the system that we've been talking about, whereas this chapter, there's so many different systems. I find this table to be a little bit more helpful for that reason. Okay, so we're going to jump right in then into reviewing the cardiac system. And so we'll start on page 386. And there are some pictures of the figures that are in the text that will be on some of the slides. But I think it'll be most beneficial for you guys to be able to follow along with the pictures in the book, because on some of these slides, we're going to be talking about these specific anatomical parts. Yet there's not room for the picture and the text all on the slide. So keep that in mind as well. So I'm starting on page 386 and just kind of going over the function of the cardiovascular system. From a gross anatomy perspective, it's a closed system that is based off of hemodynamics, or basically blood pressure. And that blood pressure is created by the heart in pumping the blood first through the pulmonary system to pick up oxygen, and then through the heart again, and then through the artery and venous system as it delivers that oxygen and other nutrients to the tissue. So essentially, the way that you should think about the cardiovascular system is that it is simply pumping the blood throughout. So cardiovascular system composed mainly of the heart and then arteries and veins. The way that it is designed or anatomically set up is that the right side of the heart, which if you're looking at the picture, remember it's a mirror image, because you're looking at a picture as a patient's body as if they're facing you. So you've got to consider them, well, what if I was in the patient's position, or what is the mirror image? So when we say the patient's right-hand side, if I lift up my right hand, I'm pointing at someone who's looking at me, I'm pointing at their left hand. So we've got to kind of turn yourself into their orientation into really understand which side is which. So when we say the right ventricle, or the patient's right heart, we're talking about the left-hand side of the heart as we're looking at it, but that's actually the patient's right side of their heart. So this is the way that this heart is sitting in the chest is actually anatomically accurate. Keep that in mind. The right heart, as you're looking at it, is actually going to look like the left heart, but we're speaking anatomically. So the right heart here is blood is going to come in from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. This blood is going to be flowing in from the bottom of your body into the inferior vena cava, and then from the top of your body, upper extremities and head, from the superior vena cava. That then flows into the right atrium. The right atrium will pump, and when it pumps, it squirts blood into the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle very quickly after it pumps. So it's got tutum, tutum, tutum of the atrium pumping blood into the ventricle. That ventricle pumps blood up into your pulmonary arteries, which splits then and then goes into your right and left lungs. From your right and left lungs, it passes through and gets smaller and smaller and smaller into a capillary system. That's picking up oxygen from your lungs and sending off CO2. And then that gets returned from the lungs into these pulmonary veins that are shown here on the patient's left side of the heart. That's what puts the blood into the left atrium. And so just like on the right-hand side of the heart, then on the left-hand side of the heart, we again have the atrium pumping blood and squirting it down into the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle follows shortly after with another pump or contraction, and that shoots blood up into the aorta. And then from the aorta, these first few vessels branching off the top of the aorta is where your blood flow is going to be sent to your brain as well as to your upper extremities. And then as the blood continues through the aorta here, it's going to actually go behind the heart and then pass down into the abdomen. And that's what it's going to enable blood to be then separated out to the rest of the body and the lower extremities. So that is essentially how the heart is beating or sending blood around. Now, when it does that, you've probably heard it recognized as sort of like a lub-dub, lub-dub. And what you're hearing with the lub-dub is the right heart and the left heart are essentially almost beating at the exact same time. So when the left atrium fires, the right atrium fires, and when the right ventricle fires, the left atrial fires. And it's squishing blood into each ventricle, and then immediately after the ventricles contract, and that squirts blood up into the pulmonary artery in the aorta. That keeps a consistent and constant flow throughout your entire body. But where you do feel the pressure, like in your artery, when you check your blood or your pulse here or here, you can actually feel the spikes in blood pressure from those ventricles contracting. So that was this slide. What takes place in that is the exchange of gases. We've talked about that before in the pulmonary system, and then the exchange of nutrients, which we'll talk more about in the digestive system when we meet tomorrow. But essentially the blood is there to fuel and to travel around all of the nutrients and gases that our cells need. So we talked about the CTOS, remember the cell, tissue, oxygen system. Well, the blood is flowing through smaller and smaller vessels as it continues to move through the body. And then once it gets down to the cellular level, it becomes a capillary. And a capillary is basically neither a vein nor an artery. It's just sort of like this bath that the tissues and the cells are in, which allows oxygen to be picked up and by the cell and CO2 to be discharged by the cell. And then that gets picked up by the venous capillaries and sent back to the heart in order to be recycled. Of course, the blood travels through your kidneys, through your spleen, through your liver, in order to have sort of some filtering take place as well. So this is sort of a larger than perspective of that description that I just mentioned, where we're down here in this capillary sort of blood bath, if you will, for the cells, in which the arteries are dropping off the oxygen and the veins are picking it up. Typically in all medical type of and anatomical type of textbooks, papers, descriptions, pictures that you see, you're going to see the arterial blood as being red because its oxygen is bound to hemoglobin within the blood, and that actually gives it a reddish tint to it. When the hemoglobin is not bound to oxygen, it gives a bluish tint to it. And we can actually see that on some patients if their skin is sort of thin enough. We can actually see the veins have sort of a dark or almost purplish type of color to them. That's because we're looking at the venous system. If you actually pull blood from the arterial system and the venous system and you compare it side by side, you can tell the difference in the blood color very clearly. Such to the case where, as a respiratory therapist, when we're drawing arterial blood, on a regular basis, we know right away if it's venous or arterial based simply on our patient's condition and color of the blood, because of it's either oxygenated or it's deoxygenated. We discussed the upper chambers and the lower chambers. Those uppers are the atriums, the lowers are the ventricles. There's valves in between the atrium and the ventricles, as well as the ventricles and the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So there's going to be 2 valves, one for each atria to ventricle. So on the right side of the heart, we have the tricuspid valve. And you can see it's pointing to this valve right here. And that is between your right atrium and your right ventricle. I always remember that this is called the tricuspid valve because tri has ri in it. And so I think right side, right, tricuspid valve. On the left side, we have the mitral valve. And the mitral valve, again, does the same purpose. It is the valve right here between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And I always remember that it's the mitral valve is on the left because the last letter in mitral is L. So I always try to think of mitral with a capital L at the end of mitral, because that reminds me that it's on the left side. So if I ever get confused between the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, I can just say, well, mitral, left, right, tricuspid. And this is how I remember things. Like, I'm not a photographic memory guy, so I can't just remember stuff that easily. I've got to put it in an acronym or some type of weird saying, or try to think about the word itself and make the word some way help me memorize what it's supposed to be. So those are the valves between the chambers of the heart. Then we have what's called the semilunar valves. And the semilunar valves are the valves that are here at the opening of the pulmonary artery and here at the opening of the aorta. And so the pulmonary valve is a semilunar valve, and the aortic valve is a semilunar valve. These ones are pretty easy because pulmonary valve, pulmonary aorta, and aortic valve to the aorta. They are named aptly in order to tell you what vessel it's attaching to. The part that you need to remember is that the pulmonary valve is connecting to the right ventricle. The aortic valve is connecting to the left ventricle. And that goes along with our previous picture that we looked at, which showed the blood coming in on the right side, being pumped out to the lungs and catching oxygen on either side from either lung. And then that being through the venous system, coming through the pulmonary veins back into the left side of the heart, and then being pumped out to your aorta and then to the rest of the body. Interesting note about the pulmonary veins are veins because they are returning blood to the heart. Just like the superior vena cava, you've got all kinds of veins that are pumping into the superior and inferior vena cava from the bottom and the top side of the body. It's a vein or vena because it's bringing blood back to the heart. The pulmonary veins likewise bring blood back to the heart. But the pulmonary veins are the only veins in the entire body that have oxygenated blood in them. So that's something to keep in mind. The pulmonary artery, right here in the middle, it is sending blood out of the heart, so it's an artery. But it's deoxygenated blood that's going to the lungs. And so it's the only artery in the body that is deoxygenated. So keep that in mind. The term artery and vein refers to if it's flowing into the heart or out of the heart, not whether it has oxygen or not, whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. Here was the slide that we left off on. I'm talking about the tricuspid, the right side, the mitral, the left side, and then the semilunar valves, the pulmonary and the aortic. The heart has several different layers to it, and I'm on page 386 if you just want to look at that picture there, rather than me skipping up forward a few more slides. because we'll get there. But the three layers of the heart, the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. From previous lectures, we know that the endocardium is the inside, the myo would be middle, and it's the muscular layer of the heart. And then epi is the covering or the outside layer of the heart. Surrounding all of that is the pericardium. So looking at this picture, the actual inner portion of the heart, the ventricle, which just means like an open space within an organ, that is considered to all be part of the endocardium. And then the myocardium is actually the flesh that is the muscle that creates the contraction. The heart in itself is mostly just one giant muscle tissue. And then you've got this little layer right here that surrounds the entire heart. That is the epicardium, which is not labeled on this picture. But then you have the pericardium, which is this outer layer out here, this little white thing that's just depicted in this picture. So the pericardium in itself is a sac, and it has two layers to itself. It has one layer that is wrapped and is actually laying on the heart muscle itself, and that is called visceral pericardium. Visceral meaning organ, so the part of the pericardium that is touching the organ is visceral. And then the outside of this pericardium is called the parietal. And parietal is the not organ side. And then inside, between the visceral and the parietal, there's fluid. And that fluid allows for the heart, when it moves and when it beats, for it to smoothly glide back and forth inside of this sac that it sits in. Now the lungs have a sort of pericardium as well, except for we call it the pleural lining of the lungs. And the pleural lining of the lungs also has that visceral or organ side lining, and then the parietal lining. And inside of it is that serous fluid called pleural fluid, so that when we breathe, we have a frictionless motion. So whether you're talking about the heart or the lungs, you've got that frictionless sheath around those organs that allow them to move as they expand frictionlessly and not have a rubbing or grating sensation. If those parts of the body, the pericardial sac or the pleural lining, get inflamed or diseased, then it can be very painful for the patient. And we'll see a few things as we move through this chapter about the pericardium itself. We talked about the blood vessels already. The blood vessels can be broken down into arteries or veins. The arteries themselves continue to get, the aorta is the largest, coming straight out of the heart. And then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller as it goes through the body. So the smaller ones then we call the arterioles. And then after that is the capillary system. We already mentioned the aorta. Same thing with the venous system. And here there's kind of some notes there. It's all non-oxygenated except for the pulmonary veins. So we've already mentioned that. Venules, just like arterioles, venules are the smallest veins in the body. And then the vena cava, both superior and inferior, are the largest veins in the body. And again, they're sort of like the collecting system for the veins. And then of course the capillaries are the smallest component of that. So you should think of your aorta leaving the heart as the largest artery, and then it gets smaller and smaller as it delivers. And then coming back up from the venous system, it's small, but then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it gets back to the heart. The blood itself is actually an organ. Oftentimes we won't talk about it as an organ itself, but it is its own organ. And it does all kinds of things. We've already talked about it carrying around oxygen and nutrients, but it also has an immune responsibility as well. So you can see here from the slide that we're talking about transporting not just nutrients and oxygen, but also waste, and then hormones and immunodefense types of systems. And then also has a regulation component to it as well by helping to control temperature and then fluids and electrolyte balance. The blood itself is made up of different sections or different components, and you can see this on page 389. Most of the blood is actually just water, and that's the plasma, which on page 389 here is the top section of this test tube. If you draw your blood and you let it sit on the table for about a half an hour, what you'll find is the bottom becomes really sludgy, and the top looks like this clear, milky, yellowish tint, not white, type of fluid that is you can see through, but not really well. And that's because it's mostly water with a little bit of dissolved solute in it. And then all of the blood cells, because they're heavier, gravity will pull them down and they'll settle out. In lab testing, they can actually spin the blood in a centrifuge and make that happen within just a few seconds. But it's pretty neat to see that if you've never seen it before, to see the actual components of your blood. So inside then the blood, we've got the red blood cells, or the erythrocytes. So we know cyte is a blood cell, or meaning cell, and then erythro meaning red, so red cell. Leukocytes, the white cells, or the white blood cells. And then the thrombocytes are your platelets, which is why our blood clots. And if we didn't have the platelets or the clotting ability, then when we got cut, we would just continue to bleed. The lymphatic system is completely different. So it's got a different function to it, although it could be somewhat viewed as similar because of how it sort of flows fluid through the body. If you're trying to sort of think about how do I keep my mind straight between the cardiovascular and the lymphatic system and blood and the immune system, there are some similarities, but the lymphatic system is not sending blood around the system, but instead it's sending lymph around the system. And lymph is basically just the fluid that is collected from the rest of the tissue and organs that then needs to be drained into the blood, because it wasn't in the blood itself, it was in the tissues. So it needs to be pulled out of the tissues and drained then into the lymph system that can then be dropped back into the blood, so that when the blood gets filtered, that lymph, the waste product, is going to be filtered. And part of the lymph system then are the lymph nodes, which you've probably all had a physician at some point heal your lymph nodes up here. And when you get sick, they'll oftentimes swell up. And then you have lymph nodes in your armpits, in your breasts, in your legs, as well as in your abdomen. But these ones are really easy to manipulate, so they're often the first ones you go to unless you're being evaluated for cancer of some point. And then the spleen and the thymus gland, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So here is the slide that basically denotes the function of the lymphatic system, and we said it drains back to the system. And some other things that it does is that it absorbs fat through the digestive system, and then immunity is its third function. So it's got those three functions. And here you can kind of see a descriptor or a picture of where most of our lymph nodes are at in the body. And again, all those lymph nodes then are pulling back and draining into one major vessel here that is going to be dropping into the bloodstream in order to screen the rest of it out. The lymph fluid itself is called lymph, and it's transparent, colorless. Unless there's something majorly wrong with the system or your body, then it's going to be transparent or colorless. And it has lymphocytes and monocytes in it. And if you're looking at page 389 still, you can see on the right-hand sidebar of that page, you can see the lymphocyte and the monocyte as different types of cells. Lymph vessels are just like blood vessels in that they are vessels that are going to transport that fluid through the body. In this case, it's not transporting blood. Again, it's transporting lymph, and it all comes back to that large area in the chest where it's dumping into a vein in order to then be filtered through the blood system. And the lymph nodes then are just lymphoid tissue that are holding chambers for this lymph fluid, and also helps to filter some of the bacteria from the blood. So as the fluid sort of goes through and makes its way almost through osmosis, if you will, through the tissues, and then ends up being collected in the lymph system, it collects in those nodes and then travels through the vessels back to the chest. The spleen which is just kind of underneath the stomach on the left-hand side of your abdomen, is the largest lymph organ in the body. So it is where lots of that filtering takes place, as well as collection of the lymph itself. Lots of times you probably heard about the spleen, like, oh yeah, you don't really need your spleen, you can have it taken out and there's really no need for it. And that's true, you can live without it, but it does play a large role in your immune system. So it is helpful to have it, but you can live without it, and that's true as well. Thymus then, which is sort of about right here on your body. So if you feel your sternal notch, it's just kind of in that area of the sternal notch. This is more so in your body's development. And once you reach adulthood, it starts to actually atrophy or not be useful anymore. So it really becomes just connective tissue after you become an adult. So we talked about the functions of the lymph system, but now we'll jump over into the immune system, and we see that the immune system has these functions as well. One, to protect the body against pathogens, foreign agents, and allergic reactions, and then also against abnormal body cells such as cancer. In immunology, you're going to focus on certain specific types of pathogens, if you will, that are causing issues within the body. And they're breaking down into, like, viruses and bacteria are some of the two main ones that we hear about all the time. And then we hear about allergens as well. Allergies are pretty prominent. Toxins are a little bit less prominent, and we see here they're using the example of insect bites, but it could be anything. Even cigarette smoke is a toxin. So it could be something environmental that's not naturally occurring as well. And then the abnormal issues, which cancer is the most obvious component of that. The immune system has 3 lines of defense. Here on the left, we see the actual categories of pathogens that we just named off. And as these pathogens, other than like the cancerous ones that are already inside of our body, but all of these other ones that are external, as they sort of come and interact with our body, we have the mechanical barrier of the skin, which is, again, we know that that's its own organ. One of its component, or one of its purposes, is to defend and keep the body safe from all of these external pathogens. So the skin is a huge portion of our immune system. That's why if we get breaks in our skin, such as cuts or scrapes, even rashes that end up being open, or when we put IVs or other types of lines, or when we do surgical incisions, we're now creating a break in this mechanical barrier in order for some of these pathogens to get inside of the body. Other types of defense mechanisms in the body is our mucous membranes, so saliva and earwax, and mucus in general. So when you cough and you cough up some mucus, that mucus is there in order to trap the pathogens that you've been inhaling, and it gets stuck to the mucus almost like a fly trap, and then the mucociliary action of your lungs brings that mucus up out of the body so that you can cough that pathogen out and get rid of it. So even our mucous membranes, our tear ducts, our eyes normally being wet, there's obviously several good reasons for that, but one of that is if we get something in our eyes, we're going to tear up to get rid of that pathogen so that it's not, again, being exposed to our internal components. So we've got that first line of defense in multiple situations, or multiple types of defenses for our body. The second line of defense comes from inside the tissue itself, and some of it is blood, and some of it is a tissue response. We don't actually have little men carrying around muskets inside of our body like this says, but there are cells called natural killer cells which are inside the body, and they're essentially a type of white blood cell similar to like phagocytes, macrophages, and so on, which their job is to go through the bloodstream, find the pathogen, and then envelop it, basically wrap itself around it, and then take it and then be filtered out through the system so that it can kill that pathogen and get rid of it. You know, that's why we see when a patient gets an infection that they've got increased white blood cell count, or leukocytosis. That increased white blood cell count is because now their body is releasing into their bloodstream all of these stored up white blood cells in order to try to take down the pathogen that's attacking it. We also see inflammation, and fever is a natural result of inflammation and the body's increased metabolism due to trying to fight off the infection. So the tissue itself will become inflamed because it is now being attacked by the pathogen. And what inflammation does is it allows massive amounts of blood to flow to that tissue. And with that massive amount of blood is white blood cells. So the inflammation in itself is a way to get all of these white blood cells into the tissue that is being attacked. The massive amount of metabolism that then is taking place results in the fever in the patient. And so when you get an infection that is severe and it's enough to cause you to become ill, then we often see a patient with a fever because enough of their body is being attacked that the metabolism is high enough that their entire body temperature is now raising. It's not just a symptom, okay, this is showing us what might be causing the problem, but it's part of your body trying to get rid of that excess heat that is due to the increased metabolism from being sick. And then the last one down here, these protective proteins, we see lots of different proteins inside the body that will jump out, if you will, of the body, of the immune system in order to do very specific types of protection to it. The third line of defense are antibodies. Antibodies are big in the news right now because of coronavirus, and do certain people have the antibodies? Are they able to go back to work? What if we find the antibodies, and can we give them to other people that don't have the antibodies? So think of antibodies like with chickenpox. You know, before you have chickenpox, you do not have the chickenpox or varicella antibodies. Therefore, if you get exposed to varicella, you're going to get the chickenpox because you don't have anything in your system in order to attack that virus. Somehow it's made it past the first line of defense, and now it's causing a problem with the second line of defense, but there are no antibody cells to come in and actually kill that virus until it produces them. And the human body, the immune system, is absolutely amazing. I mean, it blows your mind when you think about it. You've got this substance that your body has never seen before, that it's affected by it, yet it can somehow read its code. The body will read this virus's code, figure out what it is that it will destroy it, and then it will start producing these little bodies that are going to come in and destroy that virus from the inside out. So it's absolutely remarkable to think about what's going on within it. After your body has done that, now it has that memory inside of it, so that when you get exposed to varicella again, your body says, oh, hey, I've seen this before. Pull up the varicella antibodies, send them out, and it just cuts it down, and you won't even know that you've been affected by it. When you go into healthcare, you're going to get hepatitis B vaccines, you'll get your tetanus, you'll get your tuberculosis vaccine. And those are in order to give you a little bit of that pathogen so that your body will build the antibodies against that so that you will be safe from that and not harmed by it. Okay, so now we get to page 393 and actually talking about some of the words that we're going to be looking at. And the way that this is kind of set up right now, so you can see these are combining forms for cardiovascular, lymph, and blood. So we're kind of combining all of this here together. And so this again works as a good chart in order to, I don't know what this word root means. Where do I go to find it? This is a sort of like that go-to page for that. You're just briefly looking through some of this, like angio, meaning the vessels, aorta, so aorta, very common there. Artery for arteries, atri for atrium, cardia or cardio for the heart. Lymph is self-explanatory. Lymphaden would be the lymph node itself. So a little bit of a difference there. And then again, just not gonna have time to go through all of these different types of word roots, but you can see them in the text there. They're pretty straightforward for the most part in this chapter. So thyme, thymus, spleen, spleno, valves, leading to the valves of the heart, ventricles of the heart, and so on. So pretty straightforward as far as that's concerned. Some of the combining forms, we've seen some of those already, but so athero, so like atherosclerosis, or echo, like echocardiogram, electro, like EKG, so electrocardiogram. Ishk or ishko for like ischemia. Thermothermal, meaning heat, and thromb, meaning some type of clot. So here we're seeing all of the O combining vowels in order to make the combining forms. A couple of the prefixes that we're going to see: tachy, Brady, and pan. If you look at 396, tachy's not listed on there, but I added that one in there onto this slide because we'll see like tachycardia, meaning an increased. Tachy means increase. Brady means decreased or slow. Tachy meaning fast. And then pan meaning total. So like if you've heard of like Pan Am, Pan American Airlines, Pan Am means all the way or totally all around the world. If you've ever watched the Hunger Games, they call their nation Panem, or basically Pan Am, meaning it's all of their 13 colonies across the United States there. So it's Pan America, it's across America is what they're calling that. And then suffixes, so word ending the word with act just means pertaining to. Aphoresis would be moving or removal of. So like diaphoresis is a sweating. So it's an increase of sweating. And so aphoresis, we can also see like in dialysis, it's a type of hemophoresis in which we're removing the blood and filtering it. Penia means a lack of or an abnormal reduction of. Just like, so leukopenia would be a decrease of white blood cells, whereas leukocytosis would be an increase of white blood cells. Poiesis is a formation suffix, so it just means a new formation or an increase of formation of it. And sclerosis is one that we're commonly going to see with our vessels in our blood system, meaning a hardening of that vessel. Here we get to word terms built from word parts. So again, going back to category 1 from chapter 1, these are where we can actually break these down and look at them. Some good exercises in your text on this, but if we do just break a few of these down, like the angioma, we see the oma aspect. If we remember back to, I think it was chapter 2 or 3, talking about the cancers, and angi, so meaning vessel, oma meaning cancers. And so we know that there's some type of tumor issue or cancer issue with the blood vessels. Here we see stenosis and then that combining form of angio. So again, vessel and stenosis or narrowing. Same thing here, stenosis, but then aortic. So now we have a narrowing of the aorta. We just learned about sclerosis, and meaning it's a hardening. So a sclerosis or a hardening of the arteries. And then arthero, remember that arthero is that plaquish formation, that hardening plaquish formation. So if we have atherosclerosis, you've got that hardening of the plaque inside of the vessels. Talked about bradycardia, that just means a low heart rate, less than 60. Normal heart rate is 60 to 100, so anything less than 60 would be a bradycardia. And then we see megaly, an increased size of the cardio or card meaning heart. And then myopathy, a disease state of the heart, so cardiomyopathy. And we can continue on going through all of these different word parts as well. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip past this. Looking at blood, so the way the slides are mainly going to be built here is we're going to look at disorder parts that are built from word parts for each system that we're talking about. So cardiovascular, blood, immune, and lymphatic. And then we're going to go into the word parts that are not built, terms not built from word parts. So we're going to go through each of those systems. Then we'll continue to look like disease and disorder parts for each system and move through like that. So here we see that term penia. Remember, we just found out that that means a lack of or lower value of, and it's referring to the erythrocyte in this case. So this would be a lower or abnormal reduction in the erythrocytes, which are those red blood cells. So this would be commonly referred to as anemia or an anemic patient. Leukocytopenia, again, just white blood cell decrease. Pancytopenia, all blood cell decrease. Thrombocytopenia, which means thrombos or thrombocytes, so the platelet decrease. Thrombosis, thrombus, all again relating to clots. The lymphatic system, lymphadenitis. with the lymph system, obviously dealing with lymph, and then itis, so inflammation, very clear there. And remember that lymph is the lymph fluid itself, and then lymphaden is the lymph nodes. So here we have an inflammation of the lymph nodes. And then under lymphadenopathy, we have some type of disease state referring to the lymph nodes. Lymphoma, again, here we see that oma thing, so we know a tumor or a malignant cancer. Splenomegaly, megaly meaning enlarged, larger than normal, and referring to the spleen. And thymoma, again, thymus, and oma, cancerous or malignant tumor. Here's a picture out of the text coming from page 397, just referring to what does an aortic stenosis look like. This is kind of a weird picture to look at. It's like you can't really tell what you're looking at. Consider this to be inside of the heart. You've got, okay, so here's your heart. I always draw hearts like this because it's like anatomically correct, right? So you've got your left atrium up here and your left ventricle down here, right atrium and right ventricle. And the left ventricle actually is the largest component of the entire heart. It's the most muscular and it does the most work. It's the one that pumps blood into the aorta and then throughout the rest of the system. Here, this blood is going to pump out of the left ventricle into the aorta, and then it's going to wrap around and then head out to the rest of the body. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, is at the aortic valve itself. And normally it's wide open, and as soon as the left ventricle pumps, it opens it up and blood flows through it, and then it closes off again at the end of systole, which is what we call the contraction. But if we have a stenosed or a stenotic aortic valve, then we see what happens is instead of being a nice wide open type of aortic valve, we see that it's become quite narrowed. And therefore the blood trying to pump into that aortic valve is going to have a lot harder time getting into it. And as a result, some of that blood is going to be shunned back into that left ventricle, and it's not all going to make it through. So then what happens in that left ventricle is it starts to fill up with old blood that never got pumped out, because each pump is not able to pump out as much blood as is coming in. Eventually that can lead back to backfilling of the heart back into the left atrium, and then ultimately back up into the lungs as well. But typically you can hear this on auscultation with a stethoscope, and then you can also see it on an echocardiogram. And one of then the things that you would have to do if this is severely limiting a patient or life-threatening is they'd have to come in and cut this valve out and put in a new valve. And so that would be called an aortic valve repair or an AVR. And you can do the same thing on the other side with the pulmonary artery valve, and also with the mitral valves and the tricuspid valves as well.